Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Now TV. And this is what I call my morning musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm just thrilled to death that you're with me. What I can't get over is here we are. Pardon me. Already August the 9th. Holy cow. Uh, Time is slipping by so incredibly fast. I mean, this year is over half over, and we've just begun. Okay, but I do appreciate you being with me. I appreciate the fact that our channel is growing. I appreciate the fact that I'm hearing from more and more and more people that have just recently tuned in. They're just beginning to understand a little bit about fulfilled eschatology. They're just beginning to understand that biblically, eschatology is not about the end of human history. It is rather about the end of covenant history. That is to say, it is about the end of the old covenant history of Old Covenant Israel, which occurred at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, versus the view, as we're going to talk about this morning, that the Bible predicts the end of time, a time when Jesus would come out of heaven at the day of the Lord, and the earth and the elements that are therein that would be burned up, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10, which is the key passage that people appeal to prove a yet future day of the Lord. Well, what my series is doing, and I've been doing this now for several years here on Now TV, we are talking about the challenge of Christ. If you haven't gone back, if you haven't watched a bunch of the previous videos, then let me very, very quickly remind you, our new viewers, of what the challenge of Christ is, because it really bothers me a great deal when people who claim to be Christians, okay, who affirm a faith in Jesus Christ and who say that the Bible is the Word of God, and yet they do not seem to be aware of the challenge of Christ. And in order to understand this even a little bit more, I'm going to take just a little bit of a digression here. What Jesus said in issuing his challenge is not a new challenge at all. In Isaiah 43, God was dealing with Israel, and Israel was struggling, as usual, with her idolatrous ways. She had become involved with the Baal worship, with the pantheon of gods and goddesses, Astarte, Molech, etc., etc. And yet, God consistently challenged them. He challenged the priests of these foreign gods. And so in Isaiah 43, God, through the prophet of Isaiah, challenged the foreign gods, challenged the prophets of the foreign gods, and he said, bring forth your strong reasons. In other words, in support of your god or goddess. And he said, show us things that are yet to be, so that we may know that they are God. So what's he saying? He was saying, okay, you got all these gods and goddesses over here. They claim to be God. They claim to be true. So you got all these prophets and prophetesses of these would-be gods. Okay, let them make genuine, true prophecy. Let us know by making accurate prophecy that they are God. Because you see, only God can declare the end from the beginning. Only God knows the future. I got to tell you, I used to be quite faithful in every year picking up one of the little local rags, the National Enquirer. When I'd see it at the store, when they would say, top 100 psychics tell the future. Top 100 psychics tell us what the next year brings. And as I would read their, quote, prophecies, I would just break out laughing. Because every single thing that they were foretelling would be something that any astute observer of politics, of economics, etc., any astute observer could be able to tell that. I'll never forget one prime example. I don't want to take too much time for this, but it's directly relevant to the issue of the challenge of Christ, okay? I'll never forget some years ago, and we were just beginning to see inflation just start going crazy. Okay, this was back during the mid-70s. And this one prophet of God said, you better watch out, folks, because within the next year, the price of bread, the price of groceries, the price of gasoline is going to skyrocket. Well, inflation rate, for instance, under Jimmy Carter, went up to 21%. The price of gas reached, extremely high levels. Then in the 80s, we had the gas crisis. In other words, if you were watching the world scene, and if you were observant, then you would know, guess what? Yeah, price of bread's going to go up. Because after all, interest rates are reaching 21%. Wasn't that a fun time? Anyway, to make that kind of prophecy, ladies and gentlemen, did not mean that you were a prophet of God. Did not mean you're inspired. But what we find in the Bible are prophecies that are absolutely, totally, radically different. As a quick example, in Isaiah chapter 13, we have the prophecy of Amos, or Isaiah, son of Amos, concerning the fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Babylon. At the time that prophecy was made, Babylon was not even the dominant world power that existed. She was sort of kind of there, but she had not by any means reached the dominance and the prominence that she would. And yet, here's Isaiah, 175 years before the fall of Babylon, the ultimate fall. Now, within 15 years, the Assyrians actually conquered Babylon. So there are two captivities, two destructions of Babylon in Isaiah chapter 13. One was imminent, one was far off. But the one that was far off was by the Medes and the Persians. Well, guess what? The Medes and the Persians were not a major power when Isaiah 13 was given. And yet here is the prophecy of the fall of Babylon, and we'll just focus on the prophecy concerning the Medes and the Persians. 175 years before the Medes and the Persians came on the scene as a prominent military force, 175 years before they destroyed Babylon, and yet here is Isaiah predicting the fall of that city, describing it in great detail. Now, folks, it took someone with more than astute political or military understanding to make that prophecy. Let me reiterate. Number one, Babylon was not the world power that she would later become. Point number two, the Medes and the Persians were not the dominant world power that she would later become. And so for Isaiah to make such a prediction it's absolutely astounding. Now then we come forward to the challenge of Christ. which is John chapter 10 verse 37. Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Do not believe me for my works, or excuse me, for my words' sake. Believe me for my works. That's the challenge of Isaiah in Isaiah's day concerning the pagans and their prophets. But now here's Jesus speaking of himself, saying, do not believe me simply because I can utter words that ostensibly foretell something. Anybody can do that. But for someone to make a prophecy, or to make prophecies like Jesus did, and to have them come true, is utterly astounding. Jesus, after all, said, the Son of Man, and this is during a time of peace and prosperity for him, a time of popularity. But he said, the Son of Man is going to go up to Jerusalem. There he will be betrayed. How did he know he was going to be betrayed? How did he know Judas was going to do it? And he did know that. How did he know he was going to be crucified? And then to astoundingly say, but on the third day, I'll be raised from the dead. Now, folks, by any measure, that kind of a prophecy is just off the scale. I mean, after all, if your best friend told you, were to tell you today, listen, I want you to know in 3 days I'm going to travel to such and such a city, and you're going to betray me, by the way. You're going to betray me to whatever authorities it might be, and they're going to kill me, but guess what? 3 days later, I'm going to rise from the dead. Oh, of course. Oh, of course. Yeah, I'm sorry. Are you feeling okay? You might ought to sit down. Have a drink of cold water. Okay? Sure, okay. Great to talk to you, buddy. I'll talk to you a little later, okay? You see what I'm saying here? Who would believe such a thing? And yet Jesus did that exact thing. There is no other ancient event. Gary Habermas, one of the greatest, probably the greatest authority on the resurrection of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, says the resurrection of Jesus is probably the most well-attested, verifiable event in all of human history. Unbelievable prophecy, unbelievable prediction. Okay, Jesus said, don't believe me for my words, believe me for my works. But that's not all he said. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem, and he said it was going to happen in that generation. And listen, at the time he made that prophecy, what was known as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was dominant throughout the Roman Empire. It was a time of peace and prosperity. Now, were there some folks in Judea? Were there some folks in the land of Israel that didn't like the Romans? Well, undeniably. But was it a time of rebellion? No, it was not. It was a time of peace. And for Jesus to predict that not one stone of the temple would be left standing on top of another was absolutely stunning. And Jesus called that his coming as the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Matthew 24, 29 to 31. And he emphatically said it was going to happen in the first century. Now, look, folks, that was incredible. Okay, so the issue today is the great majority of believers believe that when Christ predicted his coming, he was predicting the end of time. He was predicting the end of human history, historical eschatology. That is not what he was predicting. He was predicting a day of the Lord, to be sure, but a day of the Lord just like previous days of the Lord. And you may be going, what are you talking about here, Preston? Previous days of the Lord? Oh, yeah. I mentioned the destruction of Babylon. Guess what? Isaiah 13, verse 6 to 8. The destruction of Babylon was a day of the Lord. Isaiah 34, a prophecy of the prediction of the kingdom of Edom and the capital of Bozrah. What was it called? The great day of God's wrath. On and on we could go. The day of the destruction, or the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC is called the day of the Lord. Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 10 to 15. You see, ladies and gentlemen, one of the great problems with atheists and skeptics, and by the way, let me remind you that October the 12th, I will be debating Dr. Richard Carrier, an atheist who claims to have been at one time a Christian. But he says Jesus' predictions of his coming were so obviously failures, it caused him to become an atheist. Now, here's something really, really, really remarkable. Dr. Richard Carrier agrees that Jesus' predictions of his coming at the end of the age are predictions that he posited to be fulfilled at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. I agree 1,000,000%. It's just that Dr. Carrier believes Jesus was predicting his own personal, physical, literal, bodily coming out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man at the end of human history. That's the debate. Because Jesus made no such prediction. But do you see what I'm talking about here? Very quickly, in Ezekiel chapter 13, 5 and 6, on the very verge of the Babylonian invasion and destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, the Lord said to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, "Woe, woe, woe to you." He didn't use 3 woes in that text, but he did in chapter 7. So anyway, and he said to them, "You should not," I'm paraphrasing obviously, "you should not be going about your normal business. Instead, you ought to be building up the walls of Jerusalem to prepare for the day of the Lord." What? Build up the walls of Jerusalem for the day of the Lord? Well, wait a minute. I thought the day of the Lord was an earth-burning, time-ending event. You know, when the Lord comes out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body. Wow. No. The day of the Lord would be any time, any day, any event in which Yahweh, the God of heaven, or in the New Testament, in which Jesus, as the Son of God, King of kings and Lord of lords, would in his sovereignty use one nation to judge another nation. He used the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem. It was the day of the Lord. He used the Medes and the Persians to destroy the Babylonians. It was the day of the Lord. He used the Assyrians, to destroy Egypt. It was the Lord's coming on the clouds of heaven. And on and on and on it goes. So we have been focused with that preliminary stuff. Boy, time just gets away with me so quickly when I'm doing this program, I got to tell you. So we are focused on Isaiah chapter 2. What I want to do this morning is share with you the absolute fact that the day of the Lord was not the prediction of the end of human history. Point number 1, that we've already seen from Isaiah chapters 2, and we're going to be looking at the entire context of Isaiah 2 through 4, maybe even chapter 5. But what we've been focused on is the fact that Isaiah chapter 2 is a prophecy of the last days. One step further on that, it is a prophecy of the last days, day of the Lord. Well, since it is a prophecy of the last days, day of the Lord, it should be speaking of the consummate day of the Lord, of 2 Peter chapter 3. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. When would that day come? Oh, in the last days, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3. So, Isaiah chapter 2 is a prophecy of the last days, day of the Lord. Now, this will be the subject, as I just mentioned a moment ago, of the debate between Dr. Carrier and myself. This is a prediction of the last days. It is a prediction of the day of the Lord. But let's notice something here. Verse 12 of Isaiah chapter 2. For the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased. Now watch, and it will be a day against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up. Now here's something you need to know, that biblically speaking, Lebanon was part of the northern territory of Israel. You understand that? In prophetic literature, the cedars of Lebanon began to be known as the leaders of Israel. Not just the trees. In other words, it's not talking about just a literal invasion of the country of the northern part of Israel and the destruction of the cedars. No. In metaphoric, prophetic language, cedars of Lebanon came to symbolize the leaders of northern Israel. So here is a day of the Lord. Now, mind you, it's talking about the day of the Lord. The Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning. It will be against all the cedars of Lebanon and are lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan. And we have in Amos the declaration against the leaders of Bashan. Against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. And the pride of men will be humbled, the loftiness of men will be abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. But the idols will be completely vanished. Now watch this. This is a description, a further description of the day of the Lord. And men will go into the caves of the rocks and into the holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and before the splendor of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. In that day, what day? The day of the Lord. Men will cast away to the moles and to the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves, in order to go into the caverns of the rocks and in the clefts of the cliffs, before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily, or when he arises to make the earth tremble, reading from the New American Standard. Folks, do you catch the power of this? This is very clearly predicting a day of the Lord of the same nature as the day of the Lord of Ezekiel 13, written out 200 years later. Now, Ezekiel 13 is a different day of the Lord than that predicted in, Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah 2 is talking about the last days, day of the Lord. Ezekiel 13 is predicting a day of the Lord against Jerusalem, to be sure, but a day of the Lord at the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, who destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. So we have two totally distinct, totally separate days of the Lord, divided in time by 2,600 years, but they are both called the day of the Lord. Now remember, the day of the Lord of Ezekiel 13 would be when they should have been building up the walls of Jerusalem to prepare for the day of the Lord. I mean, folks, you just got to think about this a little bit. Okay, the atheist, the agnostic, the skeptic tells us, well, obviously the day of the Lord is the end of time. It's the end of human history. How much good would it do to build up the walls of any city to prepare for that day? Now, if the inhabitants of Jerusalem could build up the walls in preparation for the day of the Lord, then couldn't those in Isaiah chapter 2 do something similar? Instead, they're told to do what? Now, let's be reminded. We are told that the day of the Lord is the end of time. It's the end of human history. It's when earth and all the elements, the whole cosmos, poof, gone, destroyed, vanishes in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. Ask yourself this question. If the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event that is over in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself how anybody would have time to run to the hills, hide in the caves, cry to the rocks, fall on us from the day, and hide us and protect us from the day of the Lord. Folks, there'd be no protection. You have no time to run to the hills if the day of the Lord is what we are told it is. I am completely, totally out of time. See you next week.